Edgy. 1. A derogatory term used to denote a dark or despair-inducing quality of a work being perceived as try-hard or attention-seeking rather than meaningful. 2. Something that's too grim or dark for me, and that's not to my taste, but I don't have an actual criticism to lob against it, so I'll just say it's edgy instead. Okay, I've got some footage of Junko here, and I probably have a reason for that. While I doubt much of the fanbase would lob the complaint of apparent edginess at the franchise, it's a perception that might not be so easy to shake. And Ashima Junko is a popular character, one of the most cosplayed video game characters of recent time even, according to a world record in Guinness. And it's a popularity that might resemble a similar trend with a strange sister and cosplay counterpart, Harley Quinn. The pair of twin-tailed crazies might strike at the heart of a similar subset of fans. Their insanity may be seen as freeing in a sense, perhaps evoking the same freedom that taking their appearance and parading about in costume might be. But I certainly don't think most of the people cosplaying these characters are actively considering the implications of potentially glorifying mental illness through liking insane characters, because, well, that's not what they're doing. But outside of the fanbase, that's another story. Not only is the idea of Dangan Ronpa being edgy something I've seen detractors label it, but the franchise gives us the perfect lens to investigate its apparent edge through the spin-off manga, Killer Killer, because Dangan Ronpa Killer Killer is two things. 1. Amazingly awful in its amount of edge, and 2. Disturbingly and despair-inducingly atrocious. Killer Killer focuses on the antics of a quirky police force investigating serial murders after the worst, most despair-inducing incident, the titular Killer Killer, Hijiri, being among them. He's a serial killer who exclusively ranks other gimmicky serial killers on their murders. And man, does this manga just revel in death and violence. Hijiri exists to evaluate various passionate killings, and look cool and stylish while doing it. As little sense as his rating scale makes, these scores stem from Hijiri's pride, as the man so often bests a low score by killing the killer in an even more wild and over-the-top fashion to mimic the murders they themselves committed. Although, despite his supposed love of these killings and the passion he feels driving them, you have Hijiri's opposite in the final antagonist, Fujigawa, who wants all of humanity dead because murder is wrong, and if everyone was dead then there would be no more murder. That makes perfect sense, right? Yet even though Fujigawa's hatred of murder led to killings without passion, Hijiri awards him a perfect score, which makes about as much sense as Fujigawa's motivation. If there's context to be had aside from the blatant contradiction, during the climactic battle, Hijiri's love of murder is explained as he claims that the brink of death is where human life shines the brightest, corroborated when the female lead, Asano, comes to fall in love with him, ending the series as they go off to commit lover's suicide. How romantic. It's all so misguided. The ending speech about the brightness of death is accompanied by scenes of several murders from the first game, and in showing these moments it only reveals that the author missed the point entirely in a way only reinforced by the rest of his own manga. There is nothing shining about murder in Danganronpa, even in Killer Killer, outside of that ending. If anything, the rest of the manga focuses on how grotesque these serial killers are as they take far too much enjoyment in what they're doing. Dear God, I feel bad even showing these images, it's just utterly repulsive. No one deserves this. All it makes clear is that the author saw the points in the trials where the culprit was revealed and went bananas before just ignoring everything else. He must have skipped past all the mystery parts because the only aspects of the murders replicated in Killer Killer is the culprit reactions and the fact that someone ended up dead in the first place. When you're playing through the class trials, the culprit going on the defensive is meant to be satisfying to a degree as you are rewarded for piecing everything together, and some well-remembered moments have spawned from these very scenes. But before these moments is a breakdown of the actual mystery, something Killer Killer largely ignores despite billing itself as a mystery manga. How Killer Killer handles evidence can be condensed into this one clue from the first chapter, a 4-panel manga that baffles Asano when she's told it's supposed to be a clue as to when the murderer will strike next. That's because she was missing the secret 5th panel to the 4-panel manga. The hiding of key information that makes the mystery go from hopelessly vague to crystal clear in a single moment is all too much like the mysteries across the manga, which refuse to give the audience any real clue as to who the murderer is except basic common narrative sense. The most insulting example is when a body gets strung up, then 6 pages later, Hijiri has already deduced a killer because he knows passionate killings. The manga doesn't even bother to give a single shred of evidence or explanation at all before the culprit confesses himself and gets strung up like a Teru Bozu. That's not to say that evidence or testimonies are never hidden in the games themselves, but it's typically used to reinforce another point, or change the course of the trial early on, rather than being the key twist to understand what's even happening in the first place. But where it really loses the thread of the actual games beyond fucking up the basic appeal of the mystery genre is after the killings and mystery are sorted out. When all is said and done, the culprit minutes away from their death at the hands of Monokuma, there's never any revelry to be had despite the trial the characters have overcome. By and large, these characters are killing each other because they're pressed to. Not forced, per se, but by and large incited and incentivized to do so. The situation is hammered home as being the cruel machinations of the madman mastermind, and effort is made to help the audience understand what drove the killers to do their killing. Despite being a supposed master manipulator, Celes walks off to her death a frightened girl trying to keep up the elegant appearance she held herself to. Tsumiki is something of an exception, but in her madness the other characters have no real response to her baffling actions that foreshadow the madness they themselves were driven to. And these moments are followed by Monokuma's executions, which carry with them a cruel, sadistic irony, ridiculing the murderer for their actions rather than glorifying them. You cannot get farther from senseless serial killings done for pure pleasure than you can the killings of Dangan Ronpa, especially the two placed right there during the monologue. Now that I've tackled some of the broad strokes, there's still a pair of parallels from the franchise to look at, specifically Genocider Sho and of course Enoshima Junko. Honestly, I'm pretty surprised that Genocider somehow didn't get as much as a reference in Killer Killer despite being the face of serial murderers in Dangan Ronpa. But perhaps that's for the best, as rather than being celebrated, her nature as a serial killer is something never portrayed as positive. It might be played for laughs as she chases Naegi around in the preludes to her free times, but in those very same free times she expresses her waning interest in murder, that same killing streak initially born out of some mixture of romantic and social frustration being stemmed at long last as she falls in love with Togami. Her murders in the past are no mark of pride, and both in the present and later in her time at Future Foundation, they serve as a badge of past shame she needs to prove herself to overcome. Never does she kill in Ultra Despair Girls, yet the game is plenty willing to revel in her goofiness as she's destroying Monokuma murder bots or being more of a genosaver than a genocider, as she is represented mechanically and in the story by using her strength to help others, especially Komaru. And as a result, you have Future Foundation's huge double standard where they uncover Hijiru's identity as the Killer Killer, and choose to accept him regardless, arguing that killing can be fine sometimes. The killer who has promised never to kill again is still being treated like the monster she once was despite her new path in life, while the killer who takes far greater pleasure in doing so and ends the series promising to make the most wonderful lover's suicide he can gets his wishes accepted with a slight, knowing smile. But where Genocider avoids the problems exemplified in Killer Killer, I only wish I could say the same for Junko. Despite her actions being far worse than Genocider's, it remains that she is paraded throughout the entire franchise almost gleefully. Danganronpa 3 still represents her at her worst, the act of treating her like an actual character instead of the plot device she is still bringing every one of her faults front and center. But even in the game, she never gets the comeuppance she really deserves. Being defeated and seemingly having her plan be unraveled in front of her just gets her more aroused than ever. The ironic element to her execution only lasts for about a second. Her appearance in Ultra Despair Girls feels like it's out of obligatory spite rather than a meaningful addition to the story, especially after the far more enjoyable and entertaining Monaco ultimately wanted to dumb herself down and become the second Junko herself. I really don't have a defense for Junko because she still represents the worst blight the franchise still feels the need to lug around. And with her being as much of a face to the franchise as Monokuma, who is also her, yeah, it's not really surprising that Danganronpa gets called edgy by its detractors. Killer Killer might be an obscure piece of shit spin-off that should hopefully stay buried in the ravines of time, but Junko is far more prevalent. She pops in to fill plot holes and allow the story to happen, shits up the ending in the process, and makes it harder than it should be for me to defend some of my favorite works of fiction. Give me a break, woman. What I hope to make clear here is that she and Killer Killer do not represent what I find to be the appeal of the franchise, even if it's kind of a shame that they're in it. Is this a note we're ending on? I hoped it would be more positive. Anyway, now that I've hopefully closed the case on Killer Killer, next on the docket is Ultra Despair Girls, and of course, the hotly anticipated Danganronpa V3, so stick around. Thanks to my patrons for their continued support, Mathwiz, Volkion, Vladimirs, and Peter Cairns. Carnes. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll see you next time.